Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crown Grace Kokon. Let's get into the video. In today's video, we're going to be looking at what if Britain never conquered India. I know there's been other alternative history channels such as What If Alt This and Alternative History Hub, which have looked at this question. But I think that no disrespect to either of them, because I think that they're really good channels to watch. So definitely check them out. But I feel that in both of their videos, they missed out certain things with that. Yeah. So hopefully I'll remember to put a link in the description. I suppose maybe because both of them are Americans, so they kind of looked at it more from the perspective of different places. But I think with this, we're going to look a lot more at what it would actually have been like for Britain and what it would have actually been like for Indians themselves. Yeah, because I think that a lot of the time it tended to focus more on how it would affect the whole rest of the world. Obviously, in some areas that they did cover some of these other things, but I think to really focus on some of the kind of finer details, I think that's what hopefully what this video would be. So the impact that India had on the British Empire was huge. I mean, really huge. I mean, so huge, it wouldn't be the same thing. Everything that we think of the British Empire, it just wouldn't be that really. What I mean by this is this. India made up 71% of the empire's population in 1925. So that means Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, Kenya, all these different places, yeah, etc, etc. Britain included, India alone made up 71%. And when we say India in this video, we're going to be talking about what currently would be India, Pakistan and Bangladesh, because these were what was known at the time as British India before the partition of 1945 or 47, sorry. Almost got the dates wrong there. You know, that's a huge amount. And then when you think about in 1870, British India made up 50% of the entire GDP of the empire. It's huge, right? India today has a population of 1.3 billion. At the time that we're talking here, it was about 300 million. A, obviously their population has exploded in the last 100 years or so, but B, if you compare it to the whole rest of the empire, nowhere else even comes close. So when we think about the so-called jewel of the crown, if it just never was British at all, how would that have affected British history, Indian history and world history? What's interesting though is that in terms of land area, in my head I always thought that the Indian subcontinent was much bigger than it actually is. It only constitutes about 2 to 3% of the world's land area. If you think about Britain as zenith, yeah, kind of owned about 24% of the world's land area. Without India, it would have still owned 21%. So it still would have been the largest empire in the world. But in terms of population, it would have gone from having 25% roughly to 7%. So that gives you a bit of an indication. Yeah, its population still would have been quite significant. Still would have been 127 million people, that from what I could see. It still is quite large, but when you think about it, Britain itself at that time would have made up 47 of those 127 million people. So yeah, the rest of the colonies weren't as significant as India was. How would the empire then look? So without India, the empire would mainly be constituted of Britain, the so-called White Dominions, so Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and at the time it was considered South Africa as well, although obviously the majority of people in South Africa were black. The rest of the empire would have mainly been their colonies in Eastern and Southern Africa. They would have had their colonies in the Caribbean, and they would have had a few colonies in Southeast Asia, such as modern day Malaysia, Hong Kong, and that pretty much would have been it. Something to bear in mind is this: without British control of India, a big part of Britain's strategic policy throughout its kind of Pax Britannica, the British peace, this was a time when Britain was at the absolute pinnacle of world domination, right? And part of that was to do with the fact it had such a strong navy, such a strong economy, and it was the most powerful country on earth, which is part of why they were able to control the subcontinent. A big part of their foreign policy ended up being very much tied up with this kind of access to India, yeah, this jewel of the crown. Because of that, a lot of their colonies that they end up having end up in some ways being linked to that, because when you think about it, in those days, ships needed coal in order to get from place to place. It made strategic sense for you to have multiple different coaling stations all around the world. That way you could travel from port to port and not have to be reliant on other countries. As a result of this, Britain having India meant that they also end up having other colonies as well, such as Sri Lanka, well, modern day Sri Lanka, modern day Somalia, modern day Sudan, and modern day Egypt, Cyprus, Burma as well, modern day Yemen, modern day Oman, multiple different places. So when you think about basically the whole kind of route from the Mediterranean all the way to India, all the kind of places that were British colonies along that route, there wouldn't have really been much need in the British having those colonies in the first place if you didn't have possessions in India, because the whole point of it was to make travel easier between Britain and India. So if you didn't have that, why would you need that? Now, if there had been no British Empire in India, how would Britain be different? Culturally, we have to recognise that India had a huge part to play. Linguistically, many words in English come from India, such as loot, such as pajama. Actually, with regard to the word loot, part of the reason why we're so aware of that is because Robert of Clive, when he ended up conquering different parts of Bengal, he ended up taking so much of the riches from all the palaces and stuff and bringing it back to England that he ended up becoming the richest man. Like, I think he was either the richest man in the empire or was the richest man in Europe at the time. I can't remember, just from the amount of like gold and diamonds and jewels and stuff that he brought back. So the word loot comes from the Hindi word, like obviously to rob things. So part of how we have the word loot in English is as a direct result of that. And also when we think about some of our greatest writers, such as Rudyard Kipling, who obviously he was born in India. He wrote the Jungle Book, which is obviously heavily set in India. All of his stories, a lot of his poems, a lot of them were based in British India. If Britain hadn't been there, where might Rudyard Kipling have been born? Might he have been born in a different colony? Would he have been born in England? Would he have had the same levels of interesting stories to write about? Would he have written stories in another colony, like somewhere in Africa? We don't know. The impact it's had culturally. I mean, when we even think about something as simple as this, what is the favourite food of British people? Curry. Historically it used to be fish and chips, but because of the ties that Britain has with India, curry is the national dish. If we'd never been in India in the first place, would that have even been part of our delicacy? Maybe. I mean, we didn't control China, but we still have a lot of Chinese food. We didn't control Italy, but we still have a lot of Italian food. We might have had some of this cuisine, but it's not a complete certainty. And I think that without those kind of cultural ties, it would have been less so. Certainly, and think about migration, after World War II, if there even was a World War II in this period, but whatever. When we think about migration after World War II, when we think about people coming from all the different colonies to Britain to come and live and work and settle, people from the subcontinent wouldn't have necessarily come here. First of all, they wouldn't have necessarily been welcomed. Second of all, they would have had no pull factor. They would have had no cultural ties, historic ties, no anything at all. And we also have to think about, for instance, the East African Asians who fled in the 60s and 70s to this country, such as for instance, the Ugandan Asians who we mentioned in a previous video. They wouldn't have had a need to come to Britain because, well, first of all, without the ties to India, without the ties to Britain, would there have even been that many Asians who had settled in East Africa? Because a lot of them were brought over by the British in order to help set up the tea plantations there and to run businesses, etc. Would there have been South Asians in East Africa? Who knows? Culturally, the impact that Britain being in India had on Britain itself, it's just huge. The psychological impact of it as well. Britain was always able to pride itself as being the most powerful empire in all of human history. Part of that was obviously the fact that we had one of the largest populations of all time. Not the largest population of any empire. Well, certainly as a percentage of global GDP, in terms of percentage of world population, because there have been many Chinese empires, for instance, which have exceeded that. But still, it's a big part of how we saw ourselves was about how powerful we were. And without India, a big part of that kind of pride and that kind of sense of superiority, I suppose, wouldn't have necessarily been there. It's a bit harder to kind of claim that you're the greatest empire in the whole world when realistically other countries have more colonies than you, are more powerful than you, etc., etc. So who knows? Also, another important thing to note is that the Indian Army, which was obviously trained by the British, armed by the British, this was a very, very powerful army. And the British used that army to suppress uprisings in many other parts of the colonies. And whenever there were colonial wars, think about World War I, World War II, and many other places, the British used those Indian soldiers, who've all volunteered, by the way, there's no conscription. These Indian soldiers wanted to fight, in particular the Sikh soldiers, soldiers who are like very distinguished, and also Gurkhas who come from Nepal, which, you know, it was never a British colony, but the Gurkhas, because of Nepal being right next to India, have always been very much tied up with the British Empire and have always like fought side by side with them. And so again, without that tie, would we have necessarily had Gurkhas fighting in our army? Probably not. It would have been harder to suppress different uprisings around the different colonies were there not for these Indian troops. So the empire would have been harder to maintain. As soon as India gets its independence in 1947, then fast forward literally about, what, 15 years, and we end up losing most of our colonies just because it's like, well, how are we supposed to like kind of like keep control over loads of these people? So how would the empire look demographically without India being there? So the best way to kind of think about it is this: it would have been a lot whiter than it currently was. If we think about the fact that if India makes up 71% of the population, what is the other 29%? 1925, this was the breakdown of the British Empire. 47 million Brits lived in Britain, 48 million people lived in British Africa, 13 million lived in the different Asian colonies, such as we mentioned before, like Singapore, Malaya, Hong Kong, etc. 9 million lived in North America, so, i.e. Canada, 7.5 million living in Australia and New Zealand and other places like that, and around 2 million people living in British West Indies, so like the Caribbean. When we kind of look at that, we think, right, that's about 127 million people thereabouts. How does this kind of work out along ethnic lines? So obviously the vast majority of people at that time living in Oceania, living in North America, i.e. Canada, Australia and New Zealand, the vast majority of those people would have been white even at that time. And when we think about British Africa, we have to also take into consideration there's a large white population in South Africa, there's a large white population in Kenya, and a large white population in South Rhodesia, which end up becoming modern day Zimbabwe. Interesting enough, actually, there was a referendum in 1922 in which South Rhodesia narrowly voted against joining the Union in South Africa. You know, obviously in both places only white people were able to vote. A lot of people wanted to join South Africa, but actually it ended up being defeated by a vote of 59% to 41%. History is full of these little weird like moments where it's like, oh, imagine if Zimbabwe had been part of South Africa. This is why alternative history ones there's no end to them, because there's so many times in history where you think if this thing had gone slightly different this way, then this would have been completely different. So this is why I'm really fascinated by alternative history. If we think about it along ethnic lines, then that means that roughly about 50% of the empire would be white and about 50% would be, well, predominantly black. If this was the case, then there would be probably a lot more case for what was known as the Imperial Federation. So around the turn of the last century, there was a big push for a lot of people to basically set up a kind of almost like a European Union in a way, but like a world-spanning one. It would encompass Britain and like all of the empire. You know, you're going to have representatives from Australia, from Canada, New Zealand, all these different places in the British Parliament, right? And this was going to represent everyone in the whole empire. Now, a big reason why this idea was scrapped is because if you have Imperial Federation and you have India, if Indians are allowed to vote in that, then the interests of the empire is going to clearly be skewed in the interests of the Indians. So basically, if you have this Imperial Federation, India will end up running the British Empire. And so as a result of this, people thought, yeah, no, this doesn't really make much sense. However, without India, there would have been a lot more kind of calling forward, because in those days, obviously, things were incredibly like drawn along the racial lines. Probably a lot of like the black people wouldn't have been allowed to vote, but the idea would have been a lot more tangible. It would have had a lot less resistance if you didn't have the position of India. And so who knows, yeah, like people talking now about CANZUK, which is, you know, Britain, Canada, Australia and New Zealand forming a free trade association, a free movement association. But who knows, that like something like that could have existed throughout like the whole empire, and in modern days it might have ended up becoming more inclusive. It might have allowed like kind of black people to vote in it. And so, you know, the British Empire today, who knows, it might still might have existed. If you think about for the whole of human history, there have always been empires. It's only been the last 60-70 years that the idea of empire has become unpopular. So it's also something to really bear in mind. The thing is, if Britain didn't own India, who would have? India has never existed as a kind of unified country beforehand. Indian nationalism came as a reaction to British occupation. Before the British came in, you had like the Mughal Empire, which was like kind of Islamic, like invaders and stuff. India hadn't really been ruled by a native regime for many centuries. India was never united in that sense anyway. The north was always governed differently from people in the south, and that's why you have linguistical differences, cultural differences, etc. We can't imagine that India itself would suddenly, without the British being there, would suddenly have kind of unified all by itself. India today would not exist without the British. However, with that being said, we do have to bear in mind that in the time when European powers were competing with each other, Britain was not the only player in that game. France would be the dominant colonial power. This is what we've said in the previous videos about what if the British Empire never existed. Definitely check those two out because there's a lot of overlap. All three of these videos kind of complement each other, which is why I've done them in such close succession. India would have been controlled by France because France already had possessions in India. You know, it already fought wars with the British in India, and actually, were it not for the battles of Wandywop, was it Wandiwash? Wandywop? Can't remember now. So that battle and the Battle of Plassey. So the Battle of Plassey, that was the really like dominant one, right? And also easier to pronounce. Those two battles were really decisive. The fact that in the 7 Years' War, which Churchill later referred to as the First World War, because it was a world-spanning conflict. In those two battles, the British, although they were vastly outnumbered by the French and their allies, they were still able to defeat them. These two battles have gone differently. If the French had been able to kick the British out of India in the same way that the British managed to kick most of the French out, how can we imagine India being governed differently? French colonies compared to British colonies. How were they run? What was the kind of overarching thing? Not all colonialism is exactly the same. It differs from power to power. So how were French colonies governed differently from British ones? The mindset of the French Empire was a lot more of a so-called civilizing mission. So the idea of their empire was basically these colonies are going to be turned into France. They're going to have French roads, French buildings, French culture. They're all going to be speaking French. The goal of our thing is that in spite of race, in spite of religion, etc., the idea is that all people within the French Empire are going to be turned into good Frenchmen. The idea of the British Empire was very much more, we don't really care how the locals govern themselves, as long as they don't have any kind of practices such as slavery, as long as they don't have practices such as they had in India, sati. So in India, if a husband died, it used to be practiced to throw the widow onto the funeral pyre, and the British banned that. There's a famous case where the Indians said, no, you can't do this here. This is our culture. This is our tradition here. And the British colonial officer who was in charge, he said the very famous lines of, in my country, it's tradition that if a man kills a woman, he should be hanged. So you stick to your traditions and we'll stick to ours. And that's how the practice of sati got put an end to. The British pretty much they had certain red lines, certain moral red lines, which they weren't going to negotiate with as such, right? But beyond that, they didn't really care how the natives governed themselves. Often the British ruled through local rulers and basically kept much of the same levels of taxation, the same regulatory processes. The only thing that the British were really concerned about was British companies being able to operate freely in those places and to extract resources and materials from these colonies to the mother country. And that was pretty much, that's how the British kind of run it. They just wanted railways, they just want to cut the bureaucracy, they want to cut out the middleman, they just wanted ease for their companies to be able to operate freely in those places. So that's obviously very different. So if you think about the main financial hubs in kind of South Asia and Southeast Asia today, we think Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Mumbai, which used to be Bombay, Kolkata, which used to be Kolkata in Calcutta is spelt differently, but the same thing, and Madras, which is now called Chennai, right? All those all those cities used to be part of the British Empire. The British basically encourage a lot of trade. They encourage places to be financial and trading hubs. We think about Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh. That was obviously in French Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. If you compare Hong Kong to Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh city has caught up and become that kind of financial hub. But it still doesn't even pale in comparison to what Hong Kong is, nor Singapore. In both of these kind of places, it's a thing where the legacy of the British Empire is a lot more entrepreneurial, it's a lot more kind of business orientated, whereas the French is a lot more bureaucratic, and it's focused a lot more on kind of like governorship rather than on just entrepreneurialism. The perfect example of this actually is within India itself, because the British didn't kick India out everywhere, but the French were still out on. What did I just say? Did I say the British didn't kick the British out everywhere? I can't remember. I have to check this back. If I've made a mistake, I've made a mistake. If I've made a mistake by thinking I've made a mistake, then that's stupid. But anyway, the French were still in Pondicherry. If we compare Pondicherry to Mumbai or to Kolkata or to Madras, it doesn't even pale in comparison. It still is relatively poor. It doesn't have that much of a big like GDP, whereas Mumbai, i.e. Bombay, makes up I think something crazy like 6% of India's GDP. Like it's absolutely like it's a booming town. Where the French went, it didn't really spur industrial growth. It didn't like kind of spur innovation or trade or commerce or anything, right? They kind of just ran it, right? And that was kind of just it. India today wouldn't be as dynamic as it is today. With French being the lingua franca there instead of English, it would have had a lot less business ties, although obviously would have had quite a strong connection to France. But India today, I don't know, like kind of, in some ways it would have been better, in some ways it would have been worse. Hello there, welcome to Hi there, sorry, I've made a mistake. I forgot, like, when I was filming this, I didn't realise that it's gonna need 2 parts. So yeah, definitely stay tuned for part 2, which is gonna be out on Sunday. And also, thank you very much for everyone who's been watching this so far. Like, I assume, like, you'll be watching this in the present, whatever, I'm waffling now. Basically, right now, it's almost New Year's Eve, and yeah, just want to say thank you to everyone who's been with me for this part of the year and in 2020, and hopefully everyone else who jumps on the wave of 2021. Hope you enjoyed the journey. So yeah, so in part 2 we're going to be focused more on like decolonization, and we're going to be focused on the actual like economic impact of British rule in India. So definitely stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, thank you and bye.